Hello and welcome to the Art Class Curator podcast. I am Cindy Ingram, your host and the founder of Art Class Curator and the Curated Connections Library. We're here to talk about teaching art with purpose and inspiration, from the daily delights of creativity to the messy mishaps that come with being a teacher. Whether you're driving home from school or cleaning up your classroom for the 15th time today, take a second, take a deep breath, relax those shoulders, and let's get started. Hello, everybody. This is Cindy Ingram, and thank you for joining me for the Art Class Curator podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. James Rowling Jr., who is the president-elect of the National Art Education Association, as well as the chairman on the the task force of equity, diversion, and inclusion at NAEA. We sat down for an interview for the Call to Art Conference that happened at the beginning of April, and I have decided to take that interview and post it here as a podcast because I really felt it was a great conversation, a lot of good stuff about curriculum and the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So thank you again for Dr. Rowling for the interview and allowing me to post this on the podcast as well. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And if you are still interested in participating in the Call to Art Conference, I know it's over now, but you still can access the recordings. So if you go to learn.artclasscurator.com/CTA, you'll be able to buy the on-demand pass to access the other 49 presentations from that week. All right, well, I am so excited to welcome Dr. James Rowling Jr. to the Call to Art Conference. Thank you for joining me today.
Sure, Cindy, thank you for having me.
So before we get started, can you introduce yourself and tell us about, your professional journey as an art educator?
Yeah, sure. Just in general, I'm a former elementary school art teacher. I'm currently a professor at Syracuse University, where I'm a teacher educator, preparing new art teachers who got into the world. I've been here at my alma mater, as a matter of fact, because I did my MFA here many years ago. I've been here since fall 2007. I am also currently the president-elect of the National Art Education Association. And that's probably why that's in a nutshell. My background is I'm a kid was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and still an East Coast kid, and I've been probably identified as an artist since I was a child, given that I grew up in a household with an art studio in it.
Yeah.
My father being a practicing professional artist and art director and graphic designer. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you see the power of being introduced to the arts very early in your life makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So how long have you been involved with NAEA?
Oh gosh, I was a student at Teachers College, Columbia University, and did my doctoral work there finished in 2003. And just prior to that, my mentor in the field, Dr. Graham Sullivan, who just recently retired, introduced me to the conference. My first conference presentation at NAEA was probably, I think, in 2002, 2003, one of those. I think it was 2002. So that was when I first got introduced to it. I was a K-12 teacher prior to that, but I wasn't involved with the NAEA at that time. So I became involved when as a doctoral student.
Awesome. So you are the chair of the Commission on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which is brand new to NAEA.
Brand new.
Just this year.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us a little bit about how that got started and what the role is of that commission?
Sure. Well, it goes for me, my connection with the work is personal, having oftentimes gone to schools where from when I was bused as a kid to pretty much an all-white school in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, from my neighborhood in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, as New York City was attempting to address inequities in terms of schooling. But so ever since then, I've gone to schools where I was typically one of a handful of persons of color there. So the work, first of all, is personal, but as far as doing it professionally, doing it for NAEA, for the National Education Association, um, from 2018 to 2019, I was part of the NAEA um, ED&I task force. ED&I is Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion.
Mhm.
And that was a task force which was put together by NAEA with the charge to really take a close look at the demographics and the histories of NAEA, as well as similar initiatives or ED&I initiatives by other organizations, and to try to assemble a research-based report with practical recommendations um, to advance ED&I work throughout NAEA and it's all of its affiliates and affiliate organizations. And so ultimately, out of that work, which was a little over a year,
Mhm.
um, we, as a task force, came up with about 16 recommendations to help make the work that NAEA wanted to do and was committed to doing sustainable, right, and and measurable.
Yeah.
The first of those recommendations was to develop uh, a standing commission, similar to the Research Commission for NAEA. That was the first recommendation. And so when I got elected as president-elect, um, partly because of my history with the task force, and partly because it was one of the roles that um, I was asked to take on as in my duties as president-elect. What I do is different than what the president does, which is different than what the president-elect does. Sorry, the past president does.
Yeah.
So in that role, I helped to lead a very rigorous and very confidential process of reviewing applications from across the nation. We got 74 applications to take seats, to draw from that 10 inaugural commissioners, ED&I commissioners, each commissioner serving either a 2-year or a 3-year term until they rotate off, and then we'll elect new folks and they'll come on board. But we convened for the first time this past December in Alexandria, Virginia, at NAEA headquarters. And
Mhm.
so I'm honored to serve as the inaugural chair of this new commission.
Wonderful. So what are some of the things that I'm sure this is an evolving commission, since seeing as you only met one time, but and
No, no.
even with the recommendation. Oh, go
Let me
ahead.
clarify. We met for the first time in December, but we've been meeting
Oh,
regularly
okay.
since then.
Okay, good.
We have virtual meetings because the work is ongoing, as you mentioned. So I want to
Yeah.
clarify that we've met 2 to 3 times
Oh,
since that
perfect.
inaugural convening, and we were set to meet again in Minneapolis, but of course everything was canceled
Yeah.
for obvious reasons in terms of the global crisis. But we will be having another meeting next week, and
Oh,
so we
cool.
do meet regularly.
Awesome. So what are some of the things that y'all are that you're working on creating for the NAA right now, if
I
it's
like
not?
that y'all, by the way. We say y'all in Brooklyn too,
Oh,
by
okay.
the
I'm in Texas, so.
way. Say it in Brooklyn too. But so the two things I would say, and in my mind, are primary goals. Other goals will be generated by talking with NAEA divisions and constituents and leaders and membership to sort of get a sense about what from the ground up folks want to see doing in their localities and their regions and their organizations and but first and foremost as I alluded to, was those 16 recommendations from the ED&I task force. Our goal is to carry those forward. I'm not going to list them all here. Those can be found on the NAEA website for
Yeah,
anyone.
we'll link to that below.
Yes, yeah, that'd be a great thing to do. But the whole purpose of all of those recommendations is to help dismantle certain structural and institutional inequities that have been a part of the association, in spite of its best intentions, and to also to help with the cultural shift towards greater ED&I vision and strategies that will aid our field in terms of greater equity, greater diversity, greater inclusion, greater accessibility. And so towards that last point is what I would say. Secondly, where our goal is to serve as a catalyst for the work of the affiliated state organizations, any partners, for individual members who might look at themselves as field workers within this effort to prioritize and brainstorm and enact sustainable structures and systems for infusing greater ED&I and accessibility into their workplaces, or into their arts institutions, or into their museums, or their communities of practice. So those are, I would say, are the two primary goals.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about from the perspective of that hierarchy of NAEA to all the state organizations, to then all the schools and all the museums and everybody underneath it, and then all the individual teachers, that every part has a different role to play.
Yeah, sure. And I would say
so most of the go ahead.
Well, just to add real quickly is that we've already had the opportunity as the in the roles of president, past president, and president-elect, to go out to state organizations and talk about this and start priming the pump, so to speak, as different regions and their regional conferences, leadership conferences, who are beginning to think about, well, okay, now what do we do with this now? These recommendations, how do we adopt them, to turn them into actionable practices? So we've already begun that work of going out and sharing what the recommendations were and what we could begin doing, as the organization itself is currently beginning to develop a new strategic pillar, along with organizational vibrancy and advocacy and research, a pillar for ED&I work. So we're things are converting slowly.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to these recommendations, and I actually did a podcast episode recently where I went through and talked about some of my favorite ones. What do you think is the biggest area for growth when it comes to, especially what an individual art teacher can do? Because a lot of people who are watching this right now are practicing teachers. That's their main role at the moment. What are some of the things that they can be thinking about right now?
Okay. So, well, I want to say one thing in particular, which is that, to my mind, and this is something that the way I conceive of diversity initiatives in general, whether you're enacting things that will change things in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever. In general, diversity to me is an organizational growth strategy. I also do this work, I should mention, here at Syracuse University. I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for our College of Visual and Performing Arts. And I think about, we tend to think about diversity, and some folks think about it in a negative way. Some folks are neutral about it. I think it is a total opportunity. So sort of the same way that biodiversity makes for strengthened ecosystems naturally. We talk about in economic growth, the need for diversification. We talk about how genetic diversity within the social groups helps to make those social groups more adaptable when changes happen, and makes them a stronger species. And so we think about diversity in those other realms, and we get it, right? But sometimes we don't get that it has exactly the same purpose in terms of associations and organizations. It actually helps strengthen the organization. It helps it to grow in ways that it can't that can't necessarily be anticipated. So so I think that just in general, wherever you are, whether you're working in a school or working in an association or a museum, if you are thinking properly about diversity initiatives, it's not just something that it's not something that needs to be done just for the sake of checking off boxes. It's not a dangerous thing. It's actually a way of growing and strengthening who your association is and who your community is. You see?
Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
I know that. Let me think. I have kind of half a question formulated in my head. I'm like it's trying to get itself together, but it hasn't quite happened yet. So when we're talking about diversity,
yes,
I just kind of want to break it down. So we're talking about diversity in like what are the different like levels of diversity that we're thinking about in terms of like diversity of the staff, diversity in terms of like your curriculum.
mm-hmm.
Is there like some pillars here that that exist?
Yeah, well, so you're asking an interesting question, because when I'm dealing with this at a college level, we're thinking about diversity as it pertains to students, but it's systemic, right? Because students, if you bring students in and they don't see folks who look like them as mentors or leaders, or to help infuse their experience with life experiences that they find commonality with or share, those students feel alone, and they don't feel supported, and they end up leaving because because oftentimes they deal with not just intentional racism that does exist, but sometimes the microaggressions that come from folks just not getting it, not really seeing them, not so what I'm getting at is that you almost have to deal with a lot of these things almost at the same time. Like if you were Thanos and you had a glove and you could snap and change everything all at once, that would be ideal, but that's not the way it works. So you have to sort of figure out the different levels, depending on what your institution is, in terms of what it is that needs to be done in order to make to allow for whatever changes you make to take, so that you don't start something and then, because you haven't thought systemically about it, thinking about the many different levels of change that might need to happen to support one new change brought in, because faculty can be brought in, for instance, or instructors, and if they're not supported within a community, as I say, it's a very homogenous community, just in terms of where they have to live and bring up their kids. They may not feel, and it happens. Folks don't feel like to stay, and then all of a sudden you have a faculty member who you bring in, and they're gone in the next few years because they didn't feel welcomed. They didn't feel like this was a community that really prioritized or valued their presence. All these things have to happen sometimes simultaneously. You have to. So I tend to think about it, though, and maybe this is helpful. I don't know. I don't think this is something where top-down edicts get it done. I don't think you hire a chief diversity officer and they're in charge of it and nobody else has to think about it. I think it's actually something where everybody it has to be involved in the work of looking over their shoulders. It's like in the kindergarten, like where I think ultimately everything that we need to do, anybody needs to know about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we learn in elementary school. When you looked out for the kid who was being bullied, or the kid who wasn't being included in the game, and didn't want them to feel left out, and you looked out for the person who was over your shoulder. So like it becomes a community effort. It's almost like you have to deal with it at a community level, so that everybody values it, understands that it helps everyone, everybody wins. if our world becomes a little bit more diverse, a little bit more equitable, a little bit more inclusive. So I do think about that part of the work is to help everyone understand that it's not one person's job; it's everybody's job, right? And then everything becomes, a lot easier that way.
Mm-hmm. So I'm a very logistical, process oriented thinker. So I'm just like, okay, how do you do that? I mean, that's your job now, is to figure that out. But for someone who's a teacher in a school that is not embracing this goal,
Mm-hmm.
what can that one teacher, how did they get that started?
Well, it's interesting. One of the places that I visited, I won't name the state organization that I went to, when I talked about this work to them, there was a couple of folks who stated very, in a very, it wasn't pushback. It was almost like, but we don't have any diversity here in our state. We have very little. So
Yeah.
it's almost like where do we start, right? Because there are very few people of color here. It's a very homogenous state. But I also know folks, a couple of folks who are on the ED&I Commission, which is very diverse, who also live in states like that, right? But are totally committed to the idea of if nothing else, starting with what they teach, right?
Yeah.
Because a part of what oftentimes happens in communities where there isn't any much diversity in the first place, it's sort of like out of sight, out of mind. It's not an important thing because it doesn't affect their everyday lives. They don't see it, they don't taste it, they don't touch it. And so it becomes something that's on a shelf, way in a high shelf. And, and maybe you pull down a project that your multicultural project for the semester. But that doesn't, I think, you can begin to combat that or push back against that or make some changes when, first of all, you recognize that the content that we have in our curriculum for learning, right? We sometimes think, okay, I got to pull this off the shelf, I got to pull this out of the book, and that's what the curriculum is. So you feel like you're responsible for giving it and imparting it. But we forget that kids come into classrooms with classroom content that's already preloaded. They have life experiences. They live in their local worlds. They have intersections and conversations with folks that maybe we've never encountered as teachers, as instructors. And I speak once again as a former elementary school teacher, and was one of those teachers who one of my, I remember a fourth grader who once talked to me about how he loved coming to my class because he loved learning about social studies. And what he was getting at was that we talked about stuff that was happening in society in our classroom. It wasn't just about teaching skills. It wasn't just about teaching, how to cut or what, and looking at works of art from history. But we actually also made art based on stories that were important to them, family stories, cultural stories, stories that they, even if you just have one or two students in your classroom who come from a background that's very different from others, and you begin to realize that everybody's got stories that are totally unlike one another. It's not just about persons of color being present in the room, but once you begin to understand that your curriculum content is not just the stuff that you pull out of your book, you begin to think differently about what you look at and what you use as a source or a prompt for creating an activity, and not just depending on what you have to do things that are new. As new people come in, new stories come to the fore, and in general, if you make a class relevant to kids in that way, so that they're engaged because they recognize it, they understand it's about real life. It's not just about stuff to do. It's not just about things to cut, but it's about real life, and it's about the way the arts have always been central to cultures and civilizations, right? And it becomes much more relevant. And then when it becomes much more relevant, the classrooms become easier to manage, because students understand that they're invested in it, and that this has to do with who they are and who we are, as opposed to what it is, right? So I think it's just a different mindset. I recently gave a talk at the Corning Museum of Glass, where I was sharing from the former NAEA president, F. Robert Sable. A long time, I say a long time, maybe 10, 20 years ago, he wrote an article called Studying Art History Through the Multicultural Education Looking Glass. And he was talking about this, thinking about curriculum differently through a matrix. And I'm going to read something here. He talks about looking at it through looking at the history of art, through the history of classified objects, through the history of competing forms, through divergent styles, through universal ideas, through changing cultures, through varying symbol systems, looking at artists as influencers, and looking at the personality traits that make an artist. But I would also add to that, just looking at the life experiences of artists who are coming from a diverse background. And if you, the more varied that matrix is, the more ways you can combine and mix and match and create different kinds and approaches to your curriculum, and make it just much more richer. And if you begin to look at curriculum differently, I think it begins to open up ways for you to affect what you're getting kids to talk about and share about and engage about. And that can be a starting point, because one teacher can't necessarily change the hiring practices of their school or the museum, but they can change the stories that they tell, and look at through an arts lens.
That was beautiful. It was just like, preach over here. That was amazing. I loved it. I just wanted to write it all down. Yeah, I just think that the people that practicing cutting and the zigzag lines and, the things that a lot of teachers focus on.
Yeah.
Yes, those things you can include, but I think we do such a disservice to our world when we limit art to skills like that.
Yeah, skills are important, but it's not the only thing that the arts are comprised of. They're comprised of identity, our stories, our family ties, our current events. It's materials, but it's also questions. It's also a communication of information about who we are and what we experienced in a particular era in human history. It's all these things. It's not just objects and skills. That's just a thin slice of what the arts are, should be defined as.
Yeah, and I think even too, when you are opening up your curriculum to discussion and conversation and story, that even if you don't have diversity in your classroom, you're teaching kids the skills to have those conversations when they're older. You're teaching them to be open. You're teaching them to be vulnerable. You're teaching them to recognize difference and to, you're teaching them all of that, even if you're not in a diverse situation. So it's only going to make the world better.
Yeah, you're teaching them to make connections, and the connections are not, and to make relationships and to find relationships, and to look, to take the second and the third look, as opposed to just one look and glance and then be done with it. When you teach those kinds of values or mindsets, when students finally encounter difference or encounter things that they don't understand, or encounter things that they've never really seen before in juxtaposition, they don't look at it and go and shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know what to do with this, and so I'm not going to think about it at all. They're actually more ready to make the connection, find the meaning. Art is a meaning-making activity, right? They're more ready to engage and to grapple with and to interrogate and to question, as opposed to turning the other way, or being incurious, not asking any questions at all, right? Um, and it makes them, gives them much more agency, right? Which is what I think ultimately, way back when I first started teaching, I began to understand myself as not just as an art teacher, but as a creativity teacher. And as a creativity teacher, my responsibility is not just to expose them to the world of art and design, but to expose them to their own sense of agency as human beings. You know, we forget that the root word of education is to educe, to draw out of, as opposed to putting stuff into students, right? So that's the root word of everything that we do, right? To educe, to draw out what's already there, to help develop what's already there. And so we can't leave we can't leave the agency on the table. You know, part of what we do as teaching folks how to be creative and to be creative forces in the world is to help them to understand that they have the agency to make changes and to find the change that needs to be made, so to speak.
Oh, I love that. I've never heard that educe thing. That's I'm gonna use that one. That's really good.
Well, I was one of those kids who didn't read the dictionary when I was growing up.
Oh yeah.
So etymology is an old friend to me.
Yeah, I really love that, because that's one of the things I talk about is that so nowadays we are so trained to look for answers somewhere else rather than inside, and so that's really cool. Okay, so I love this conversation. Also, I'm wondering, we are what I see, I think I'm seeing it in myself. I was trained this way to not rock any boats, to keep quiet, to not offend anybody. And so you get stuck in this to where then you're afraid to speak up, or you're afraid to get something wrong, so you just don't say anything at all. Do you know where I'm going at with that? Like, how do we, and I know that's the wrong tactic to take when it comes to having these hard conversations. Like, what are some things we can do to help ourselves and our students be brave enough to have these sorts of conversations?
Well, so I would say, Cindy, that it's very much about modeling that behavior ourselves. You know, human beings, just like all social creatures, we need models to live by, stories to live by, models to extrapolate from. You know, that's why we have mentors. Our teachers can be those, but you know, if we're asking certain things of students, to be the one who's daring to ask the question, the one who is willing to look out for when everybody else is turning the other way, and if someone is being bullied, well, even if everybody else is bullying that person, how does someone feel the agency to be the one to step in? They probably have seen it modeled by by a parent, or by a friend, or by someone they respect. We have to model that ourselves. We have to be willing to, like I say, take the second look and the third look. And we have to, you know, and talk about it with our students. So that's said, you know, oftentimes, and I've seen, to me, the best teachers are those who are not performing teacher, but are practicing relationship with their students. And so if they're having a bad day, the students know that they're having a bad day. If they're frustrated, the students know that they're frustrated. If they're happy and things are something that's worth sharing, you know, they sit down in a circle and talk about it. So you have to practice it and model it for your students. Otherwise, they don't know that it's a thing to do, or that it's valued. You know, so it's about building a culture where a classroom culture, just within your own classroom, to start with, right? Where you're willing to do such things, talk about things that are important to talk about, or and are, if obviously you understand the needs of, you're trying to, you're not trying to for the sake of tipping over the apple cart, tipping over the apple cart. What you're doing is looking out for the best interests of your students and their families, and so that sometimes means being a voice in the wilderness. Sometimes, hopefully, hopefully you're not that lone voice, but sometimes you have to be. And if you model that, I think that the students will see it and recognize, at least in this place, it's safe to talk about certain things.
Yeah, I love that. And but I think a lot of teachers walk around in fear of what the parents are going to say, what the administration is going to say. So on Art Class Curator, we share, all sorts of types of works of art. And I get comments sometimes, they're like, oh, I can never show that to elementary kids. I'm like, yes, you could.
Yes.
They can handle all of this stuff. They can handle these topics, but they're so worried about getting in trouble or having to fight with the parents, or that they choose to play it safe.
Yeah, so I can just say it was one quick thing, because I know we're running out of time. But I remember once one of my favorite projects with my I would say it was my third graders. This is many years ago. I haven't taught in elementary school for quite some time, but I did a project on political cartoons. Typically, folks do that kind of work in high school, middle school. But I knew that I started by prompting my students to talk about the things they have opinions about. What is something that you wanted to change or do in the world that something you see in the world that needs to be fixed, or that we can do better at, or something like that, just to get their because I knew that there were opinions and ideas in the room that were never given an opportunity to be voiced. And so part of the project was in showing them political cartoons, the history of it. We happened to have a family, a parent who was a well-known political cartoonist, and we had him do a little workshop on what he did, right? And ultimately, the whole goal was to get to the place where students would work on from their opinions about the things that were important to them to see changed, to then express that in the form of their own political cartoon. Understanding that to be critical is to be political, right? And understanding that it's not just, political cartoons were never just about politics. They were about being observant about things that needed to be changed or fixed, or that we could do better at as a society. And so it turns out that every kid had their own opinion about something that was important to them. And so in the end, when we put a little gallery of political cartoons up online, no parent could quibble with it, because these were the ideas of their kids. I didn't tell one of the students in my 3 third grade classrooms what they should draw about, or it all came from them, right? So the parents could only be proud, right? They couldn't quibble with it, right?
Yeah, I love that. That's really good. Love that. Okay, so we've completely gone off all the questions that I wrote, which is totally fine. That always happens. I just write them just to make myself feel better. I know it always goes somewhere else. Yeah. So to wrap up, I think that what I really loved about this talk on curriculum was that it's not about just doing another multicultural project this semester, that you can infuse every lesson with these sorts of conversations, that it's just not about adding in,
not about checking a box. It isn't.
Yeah. It's a complete framework for how you view every single lesson that you do in your classroom.
Yeah, it's like, you switch out, allows you to switch out lenses, so that you're seeing, how sometimes, put the red filter in, you see certain things, put the green filter in, you see certain things, but allows you to change out those filters and be aware that things are being filtered out sometimes, those unconscious biases that we have, that sometimes we need to put in a new lens every once in a while and see that something through another person's story, through another person's expertise, through even our students' expertise with their own life stories, right? And allow that to see our curriculum differently and to rework it and say, oh, it's and we're used to this because we're all artists, right? So we should be used to it. And if we've forgotten that it's all a work in progress, then let's get back to that mindset that it's not a static. Your curriculum is not a static thing. It's something that's a work in progress, and that should be changed from time to time, moment to moment, as is needed and as is possible, in order to keep it relevant and to keep it current and to keep it inclusive.
Awesome. Okay, so to wrap, I think that was a very good ending. So to wrap it up, I'm gonna ask you the question that I ask everybody on my podcast. So I'm asking it here too because we're doing an interview, and that is, which artwork changed your life?
That was it's an interesting question because I'm not a I grew up in walking distance from the Brooklyn Museum, which is actually a world-class museum on Eastern Parkway. And I used to love that museum. But the works of art that, I could speak about, a Rembrandt that affected me, or this and that. But I'm going to go back to something I mentioned earlier on in this conversation, that I grew up in a household where art was being made. I grew up in a household with an art studio in it. It's a second floor apartment, but there was an art studio that was always there, and my father was always at work, and he allowed me and my brother, who also became an artist, a graphic designer. We all went to the High School of Art and Design. My father went to it. It was called the High School of Industrial Art. But from when I was 5 years old, 6 years old, I identified as an artist, and so my father did a portrait of me as a child, which I still use for different reasons and publish about it. And but that image is one of the oldest images of me. That portrait that he did of me, he saw something in me in terms of my ability and my willingness and my peculiarity to make connections. And instead of just like my natural hair texture, he created sort of like this network of lines and designs that suggest lots of connectivity happening. Like he was almost like X-raying into my head. And that particular image stays with me, and I've used it over and over again. And I'm in my 50s now, and so that's that. So I would say that the image, the artworks that changed my life were artworks that were nobody else knows about. They're in my home, except for me sharing them in a publication. So my father wasn't a famous artist; he doesn't have any work in any museums. But that gets at something which is important to me, which is that every human being is a creative being, and sometimes we are more aware of that creative gene, and sometimes we're less aware of it. Sometimes it gets schooled out of us. Sometimes we get convinced that those people over there are creative, and I'm just like, what? I don't know. I'm not creative. And so many of our students think that way. And I think that I learned by the fact that I grew up in a household full of artwork that nobody will ever know about. They will never be famous, but they were part of my everyday life. Right. And I think that's that notion that my creative ability is supposed to be a part of my everyday life, just like it was a part of my father's everyday life, my brother's everyday life. I think that's what has changed me and made me who I am today. Yeah,
I love that. And to get me started on art is only good if it was in a museum. That's no. So that's wonderful. And do you have a link or somewhere that we can share a picture of that artwork?
Sure. It? Okay. I can send it to you after the call.
Cool. We'll put it in the links below.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think I have a LinkedIn article actually that of all things, a LinkedIn article that features that particular image. So
wonderful. We'll link to that below. And last question is, what can art teachers do to support your work? Is there a place they can watch what you're doing, or on social media, or is there any sort of things that they can help with?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So just in general, in supporting the work of the our commission, the Commission on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for NAEA. First of all, I don't know if anybody in your audience is not an NAEA member. I would encourage folks to become NAEA members if they aren't already, or to renew their membership. But part of what I ask folks to consider doing at their locality, I ask folks to think about themselves, to transform themselves into ED&I field workers, because everybody wins that way. So I asked, when I went to a recent state conference, I asked folks to think about 4 different things. Thinking about ED&I as something that wasn't something that somebody else did, but something that I did as a teacher, right? So ask yourself as a teacher, what are the needs in your school, your organization, your institution, or state association in order to bring about greater equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility? Secondly, I asked the folks to think about what is most needed at present in order to shape or advance a viable ED&I initiative in their own organization or their local region that will grow or strengthen their professional community. I asked them, what are 1 to 3 ED&I ideas that you yourself as a teacher can present to your principal or to your state leader or to your colleagues for discussion and development and commitment over the next year, so you can have a small incremental change instead of thinking big giant picture. And finally, what are the steps or action steps in order to execute that one of those ideas, and to sort of break that idea into steps in order to get something done, right? And so I'm asking folks to think about themselves differently, as a worker, towards bringing to greater diversity, which to my mind is greater strength to their school or museum or wherever they work, and then to work with others to figure out how to get those things done. You can't do it by yourself, right? Because like I said right from the very start, it's work that everybody has to do as a community in order to do it well, right?
Awesome. That's great. So we will. Do you mind if I type that up and put that below this video too? Those 5 recommendations.
Sure, I can, and I'll just email it to you so you can just cut and paste.
Perfect. Yeah. So we'll link to that just so people can go back to that, because I know I wanted to rewatch that part to make sure I got it all down. Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you so very much for joining us today. It was
Thank you, Cindy.
really great. Awesome.
Thanks again to Dr. Rolling for that amazing interview. And if you are interested in hearing or watching the rest of the presentations from Call to Art, remember you can go to learn.artclasscurator.com/CTA to get the on-demand pass to access the 50 sessions from that amazing online conference that you missed back in April. Thanks again. I'll talk to you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the Art Class Curator podcast. Help more art teachers find us by reviewing the podcast and recommending it to a friend. Do you have a work of art that changed your life? If so, send me your art story. You can send it to support@artclasscurator.com or leave a voicemail to 202-996-7972. Get more inspiration for teaching art with purpose by subscribing to our newsletter, Your Weekly Art Break. Recent topics include how to support English language learners, why we should teach artworks from Black artists even if it isn't February, and how to deal with teacher burnout. Subscribe at artclasscurator.com/artbreak to receive 6 free art appreciation worksheets. Today's art quote comes from Bruce Garabrand, and he says, "Creativity doesn't wait for that perfect moment. It fashions its own perfect moments out of ordinary ones." Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.